Are we ready to start?
Yeah, if we're not ready, we're in trouble.
Well, everybody, welcome to an evening with two Latin American writers. Not often you get to see them in this country, so I know it's very special for a lot of you here. We have on my extreme right, Ariel Dorfman. I was here yesterday among a lot of other people discussing the global Shakespeare, so it's very nice to have somebody who's named after a Shakespeare character.
That is correct. and a Latin American character.
Yes.
Yes, because Ariel is the name of given to Latin America by José Enrique Rodó, an Uruguayan, in order to differentiate Latin America from Caliban, which supposedly was the cannibal, you know. And then in our century, that was turned over by saying Latin Americans are the cannibals and we must devour the whole world, which is what we're doing right now, right?
And in the middle, I have, well, I'm not sure. You know, I heard I was going to meet the Peruvian writer Santiago Roncagliolo.
Yes, you say it very well.
But you don't look like the person in your picture, and I do know that this writer likes to blur the line between fiction and reality. Maybe he sent his twin brother.
No, I had conjunctivitis, is that the name in English? Of this problem with the eyes. So I stayed 2 weeks without watching myself in the mirror. And when I just wake up, I say, I have a bird. I never had this thing before. So I will keep it as long as I can.
One question, Santiago, but when you have conjunctivitis, other people are not allowed to look at you, but you can look at yourself.
I don't look at myself. In fact, I never look at myself. Even before the bird, people always tell me that I look different in the pictures. And that's good because, in fact, my books are also very different one from each other. So I somehow voluntarily, I change a bit the character for each book. And I guess I'm a frustrated actor. I wanted to be an actor, but I was too shy. So this is the only way I can be in a stage.
Wait. There's a contradiction here, Santiago.
What?
If you didn't look at yourself before, how did you not recognize yourself in the mirror when you did look in yourself?
This is really wonderful.
Because
this is the logic of Latin America, but also the illogic of Latin America.
But I recognize myself because the guy in the mirror looked like my father.
I answer that by saying, I happen to be a friend of your father, and you don't look like him at all.
I hope so. I hope I'm thinner than my father. My father is this way.
But no, when he was your age, he was slimmer.
I hope so.
So you can still hope that you will grow to be like your father.
Thank you. That's the most horrible thing somebody has told me in my life. Thank you very much.
My friends, I mean, I just thought I began with some light conversation, but we're going off in a completely different direction.
No. The direction is that Latin America, which is known for its horrors and its magical realism, both of which we deplore, is a very humorous land, full of vitality, just like India. You know?
Nobody knows, but we are very funny.
Yes. Well, at least
when you say it out like that,
we've just discovered how funny we are. We had to come here.
Okay, well down to business for a bit. And now 10 minutes
now we're going to tap dance a little bit like this. You know?
I have to say, this is the most entertaining times I ever had at the JLF in many years. Okay, some serious stuff. You know, what we want to do in the little while we have tonight among a lot of very interested people who read Latin American novels is to discuss newer novels than the ones most Indians know, which is the generation of Vargas Llosa, Fuentes, and Marquez. And it seemed to me that before we look at new books, we have to look at the new ideas that stand above them. And I wondered, first of all, whether we should, for once and for all, abandon this very difficult and stereotypical and misleading term, magic realism.
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that I really don't like that term at all. And I don't like it for several reasons, but the first one is that when you say magical realism, you're speaking about a style. And a style meaning you turn reality into something magical. You, the artificer, the thaumaturger, you know, the magician, do that. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, because it's not a style which you can copy. which is what's happened. It's been copied over and over. You know, Isabel Allende copies Garcia Marquez, and then it's copied by others over and over again. And then it becomes a style and therefore devoid of reality and of realism of the reality. But also because it has a tendency to be marketed in a certain way. And therefore, if, for instance, he writes a novel where you don't have virgins levitating, then there's 100,000 less readers, you know? And we're still, if I have a fantasy where somebody is in a room and is destroying the reality of the people next door through a television camera, that's not magical realism. Or why am I not being magical realist? Can I just be fantastic? I mean, is that so? So it's this pressure from the market and from a certain exotic vision of Latin America, you know, that I disagree with. I prefer, if you're going to use a term, one which is coined by Alejo Carpentier, a Cuban novelist, called Lo Real Maravilloso, the real that is marvelous. Because if there is something marvelous or magical in our reality as in yours, it is in the way in which people tell the stories of what's happening to them. So therefore, the story becomes exaggerated. If any of you were to play telephone or telegraph with one another, and you begin with a story back there with that gentleman with the hat, and you go over there, it'll turn into a totally different story. And that telephone, telegraph, repetition, and therefore change, transformation, transmogrification of reality is what happens we're storytellers, right? And therefore, I don't like the idea that we're stuck in this box. But here we have somebody who, in fact, belongs to a generation which broke with that tradition very violently, in fact.
Yeah. I was thinking, I mean, if you are Peruvian, your case is a bit different because they do not expect you to be magical realist, but they expect you to be Mario Vargas Llosa. Which is a realist and a very political writer who has been candidate to presidency and has the Nobel Prize. So what everybody expects from you is being candidate to president and having a Nobel Prize. And when you don't, they feel really disappointed at you. And in fact, what happens to me, which comes from the same generation, because we have put everybody in the same box and have the feeling that all of these people were magical realism, but they were very different people among these big writers of the Latin American boom. And what happens usually to me, more than magical realism, is that everybody wants me to have an opinion about almost everything in this planet. When are troops getting out from Afghanistan? What's going on with the global financial
when are
crisis?
They getting out? Tell us, please. Tell us. It's very important to know.
And once I had in Belgium a journalist. He sit in front of me for an interview, and he began. The questions were the list of the Latin American presidents, for me to have an opinion about each one of them. And we're talking about 22 countries. And I had the fear that he would ask me about Suriname and French Guiana and these kind of countries you never heard about.
We can invent an answer.
He wanted me to have this, I mean, people talk to you a bit like you were a priest. The guy who has all the answers. Because and sometimes I pretend I do have them.
But Vargas Llosa also pretends he has all the answers.
Yeah, of course. He has a Nobel Prize, man.
Right. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because your novel, Red April, is a kind of crime thriller.
Yes.
Or it uses the genre tropes of the crime thriller to do something that goes beyond that. And this is one, you might say that associating Latin American writers with magical realism is a kind of cliche, but associating them with narratives that involve violence is not. A lot of Latin American novels, and you, Ariel, have written a book about Latin American writers in which you bring up this idea many times over about how, about violence in these books.
I mean, my second book was called Imaginación y Violencia en Latinoamérica. Y de repente podríamos hablar en castellano tú y yo para que sepan que es cierto. Just so we're just speaking in Spanish to realize that we really are Latin American. We are not making believe of it. But my first book was about Harold Pinter.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, in the sense that we'll go to violence. I just want to say, in one sense, Santiago, you're right, and it's very irksome and vexing for them to ask us about the whole world. On the other hand, it's really true that we're interested in the whole world. We are very interested in the whole world, you know. They used to say about Borges, what other writer in the world would write about Sanskrit, about Scandinavians, about the Ring of the Nibelung, about the Arabian Nights, etc.? Well, an Argentine, obviously.
Yeah, it's
right?
very Argentinian.
Very Argentinian, right? So, and that, also about the gaucho, which is very important for him. But what I'm trying to say is that my first book was about Harold Pinter. It wasn't about the violence in Latin America. Now, what I discovered in the second book was that, in fact, violence was something that was imposed upon us, and that writers could not, in Latin America, veer away from the violence, because it would find us. That doesn't mean we have to be necessarily political, though we are very political in the following sense always, that these are republics that are always trying to form themselves. They're still always in a constant somewhat, I think, like you are, you know, of self-definition and identification. And therefore, you know, the task of novelists, among others, is to imagine in such a way the complexity of the country so the country can find itself in that mirror. And in that mirror, you have to show violence because the violence has a double meaning in Latin America, which probably here as well. One is the violence is inflicted on people, or we inflict it on ourselves, and then it is lied about. It is hidden. The violence is there, and then the government or the mafia will try to hide it, will try to disappear it in some sense. So we bring it to the surface, and I speak now of Santiago and myself and all of us, you know, because you can't make believe, you know, that it's not there. Even Borges, you know, always ended his supposedly apolitical fables with somebody being killed at the end and having a revelation of a violent death. And it's very Latin American again.
Yeah, that's true. I really wrote about violence, but it was a mistake. I wanted to make a serial killer novel, and which I did.
But it's about corruption.
I had been, yeah. I had been public employee. Yes, I had working for the state in human rights for a few years, and a few years later, I said I want to do something in this genre, in this serial killer thing, because I love the genre. And I just used the reality I knew. I was not thinking I'm going to make a political novel. I just talk about the things I have seen, which included corruption, killing, massive killing, and all the things I considered normal. And
but not in Lima, not in Lima.
Not in Lima, it's in the country,
right.
It's in the mountains of the city. And suddenly it was, for me, a surprise that everybody considered that a very political novel. And I realized it was. Of course it was. But I just wanted to make a normal thriller, a serial killer thriller. And it was funny how Europeans, probably Asians, read it as a crime novel. And Latin Americans would read it as a political novel. And since I was talking about the war among the guerrillas and the state, everybody had similar things in Latin America that they could recognize in the novel. So it was also a novel about Chile, about Colombia, about many countries, about Cuba and Central America. But it was all a mistake. It was not my intention.
Well, I think it was Whitman who once said that for literature to go forward, its readers need to be ahead of its writers. They need to be dissatisfied with what they see in front of them for somebody to try something, to do something new. And I wondered if the two of you, you're very close observers of Latin American literature, what you have to say for Latin American literature currently and who's doing that sort of work? Who you like reading?
In my case, I've lived out of Latin America for many, many years now. Santiago lives in Barcelona. I live in a small town in the south of the United States. And I've been in exile a good part of that time, and expatriate a good other part. I go back consistently. So I don't read as much Latin American new literature as I do, for instance, new American or British or Indian or Malayan or Japanese. I mean, once again, like Borges in that sense, it all belongs to me. And there's no reason why I should know more about that. Yeah. I can say that I find some of the younger writers, younger than me at least, you know, very interesting what they're doing, and I like the way they write. That they make very good writing. Like me. Like you, for instance.
Thank you,
absolutely. I like Ariel Rojo. I really like this, and I told him so, and I'd read it many years ago, because I liked the crime thriller. I thought, well, it won the Alfaguara Prize. Let's take a look at this. And I really was very, very interested in it. I'm very interested in any novel that is able to indirectly, obliquely, show the corruption that is happening. But what you do is you grab people and you put them inside this genre that they like, and then you play with them, you know, in that sense, very playful. But young Latin American writers, they're very abundant. But I don't know whether you read more of them than I do in that sense.
Well, I enjoy a lot something very interesting now happening, especially coming from the place of magical realism, is that the more interesting thing happening now in Spanish language and literature is journalism. Is many people of my age writing real stories and trying to write them good.
Yeah.
Try to make good texts and good stories, which are not just interesting because you want the information, but because they tell very human and interesting stories of what's going on in Latin America. And in fact, I also make non-fiction books. Nobody knows because the novels devour the rest of your job. People look at your fiction, but something very interesting in Latin America right now is non-fiction.
Right.
Maybe here also?
Yes, I think Indian non-fiction is very good now.
I guess it's global. Somehow we have arrived to a moment when we do not believe many things. We don't even believe the newspaper. So,
especially not the newspaper.
Especially not the newspaper. We do not believe the politicians. We do not believe the system. And that's happening worldwide. So
the best place, the
best way of fiction is non-fiction, really.
But Garcia Marquez also was a journalist before he started, you know, and his non-fiction is excellent.
Yes, that's true. But it was not a movement.
No, it was not. No. He started as a journalist in the Hemingway Forum, you know, to begin as a journalist, which is very typical of many Latin Americans as well.
Well, Santiago, I hate to bring up Mario Vargas Llosa in front of you since he's been president of Peru and you haven't yet.
No, not president.
He's not president.
Oh, candidate, yeah, that's right.
When he lost, I sent him a letter congratulating him. I said, this is a great day for literature.
But why did you think that? Because in Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel became president, that's fine.
Yes, but he never wrote La Ciudad de los Perros. He never wrote, you know, no, what I mean is, you know, Václav Havel was a great essayist. He was a great playwright as well. But he was not a novelist, and that wasn't his fundamental thing. No, Mario, it made no sense whatsoever for him to run, I think, and he would have made a very bad president, I think. But he was very fascinated with power. We're fascinated with power in Latin America.
Well, but that's something this generation. I mean,
yes.
All these people from you, around you,
yes,
elders and younger
yes.
and youngers. Magical realism is not a common feature of all the big writers of Latin America. Politics, yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
They are all candidates to presidents or
advisors to the president.
Advisors of Fidel Castro.
Right, exactly.
Carlos Fuentes had dinner with Bill Clinton, and this political stuff, this fascination with power was common to this generation. What happens in my generation is that we are very skeptical. We are more distant. We do not want to be really involved. We do not believe easily in politicians or ideologies, and that changed a lot the kind of public figure you are and the public image you project.
Right. Well, I remember in his book, A Writer's Reality, Vargas Llosa says that while literature may not be important to every person in Latin America, sometimes they go to soap opera for the pleasures of narrative and not to books. Fiction as a category is very prevalent because nobody really knows what the truth is, and so that's why the writer has a special duty to talk about things that you don't otherwise see in the public sphere, not even in journalism sometimes. Is that still true?
Well, I love soap operas. I mean, I guess what I do is, in fact, I've written soap operas for a while in my life. And I really
You've done everything, Santiago.
I need a job, man.
Eres el escribidor.
See? And soap opera and melodrama, in fact, is the only truly Latin American narrative gender. It's the only thing we invented. Because many things in the big writers had influence from Faulkner, from European, from French literature, from North American literature, but the soap opera is ours, man. We did that, And when I was working on that, by the way, we had a lot of admiration about Indian films, very sad and crying Indian films. We love that stuff. And
but in our soap operas, they don't start dancing in the middle of it. No.
Yeah, we are more boring than
yes.
Indians. And I discovered many things writing soap operas. You need a lot of creativity and imagination, because I don't know how it's here, but we come from Catholic countries, very, very conservative morally. So you need really a big imagination to keep the main character virgin for 120 chapters. You know? That doesn't happen in the real world. After 3 chapters, nobody's virgin anymore. And I also got a wonderful feeling with TV, because I could got into a bus and listen to the people sitting in front of me talking about my characters. They didn't know who I was. They didn't care. They didn't even know there was a screenplay besides. I mean, that they were reading things. But they had a connection with these characters. These characters would slip into their lives all days. They would follow them. They would share their personal, intimate life. And that's something more complicated to do with a book. A book usually is not a bad soap opera, has like 10 million audience. A good book, maybe 10,000. And me and many people in my generation, that also changed. In Chile was Fuguet, for example, which is a bit older.
Fuguet, yes.
Begin to look as TV, as cinema, as part of our culture. And in fact, it's everybody's culture. What I've realized in travels like this is that we have not always read the same books, but we have seen the same films, Hollywood films. We have seen the same TV shows. And so in the 90s, many people in Latin America begin to write like me, like Fuguet, with lots of influence from popular culture, from pop culture, from soap operas, from thriller, from popular genders. And at the beginning, they were smashed by the critics. They hated these frivolous, young, alienated writers. But after 10 years, they just got used to it. And now everybody leaves us alone. We can do that. At the same time that we can also make political things. It's not that you must choose one thing. You can have the influence from the big writers, from the high culture, from the popular culture.
But I mean, having written the first book which made me notorious, I won't say popular, was How to Read Donald Duck, which was a book which was a critique of Disney as an imperialist. So I have nothing against the fact of using popular culture, as you know well, Santiago.
Yeah, it was more about what it means.
Right, exactly. But what I'd like to do is lift my feeble arm in defense of literature in the typical sense of what you're suggesting. Because the one thing that the soap opera cannot do, I mean, it can tell these stories and bring these stories and mix up the stories. But what literature can do, and what it has been doing, and what your generation is doing in spite of itself, because it's going back towards this, is it can muddy the waters of reality, because they are muddy. So when our governments especially, or our press, or the big people who have all the discourse, the speeches, you know, say everything is fine, we answer no, things are not fine. And when they say there are very simple answers to things, we say no. In fact, it is very complex and very transgressive what we need to do. So the role of literature is not necessarily political in the immediate sense of telling us what we need to do, but telling us how complicated reality is, and how what we think is reality may not be reality. It's always been like that in Latin America. It's just that from the very start of a republic, there was a need for this discourse to try to discover who we were. And literature has a function in that sense which continues to be very, very strong. People go to literature for entertainment, but they also go because they want to think about things. They want to discover They want to ask questions. They don't want answers to things, you know? And therefore, the relationship between the popular and the high culture, as you say, in Latin America, especially from my generation onwards, this is a generation of Sergio Ramirez, of Scarmeta, people who, you know, Il Postino, for instance, okay? The typical, many of you have seen that film, right? Il Postino, the Italian film based upon a Chilean novel. Well, there you have a typical relation between Pablo Neruda, one of the greatest poets that humanity has ever created, right? And a very ordinary postman who needs Neruda to teach him how to do verse so he can seduce the girl that he loves. So this relationship between the popular and the high is a constant question for Latin America. And you can't go without it. You need Shakespeare, but Shakespeare himself did it. So it's always being repeated. It's just in Latin America, the popular is right there at the door immediately. I insist that it's very much like India in that sense.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. We are, precisely because we are not so popular as TV or cinema, we can be more free because there's less money involved. You are cheaper.
The less money, the better.
You don't have to pay for a book, you don't have to pay $4 million as you must pay for a film or TV. And that makes us more personal and more... we don't need to worry about the producer and how he needs money. And in my family, your book was admired. Your book about Donald Duck was the Bible of my father. But I wanted to tell you something, because when I was 8 years old, my father, who was very left-wing and very obsessed with culture, and with people should read and his children should read.
His father's the present Minister of Foreign Affairs of Peru.
Yes.
Yes, just in case.
By the way, yes. He arrived to that. But in that time, he just was a left-wing with a beard, by the way.
A beard, yes.
He had
to look in the mirror.
And he said, okay, you are 8 years old. Enough of stories for children. You need to read a serious book. And he took me to the bookshop and he told me, I'm going to buy you the book, any book you want, as long as it has it's not a children's book. So I began looking around the books, and there was a book with the Donald Duck
on the cover. And inside as well.
I said, I want this one. I said, okay. Dorfman is a correct philosopher in the correct political line. And she bought me your book. Then I begin and I didn't understand. I read it later.
Well, you know, I still don't understand what's it. No. I wanted to say something about the popularity of literature in Latin America. And this may also ring a bell here. There's a story about Neruda, our great poet, who goes to Colombia, to a small town in Colombia. And he begins to recite, and then he realizes that the poem that he's reciting has disappeared from the book. And he says, I'm sorry, I don't remember it. And the people stand up and begin to recite it back to him.
Oh, what a beautiful thing.
So that is the relationship that does exist. And that I think it's very important to realize that. We have a relationship with our people. And then, of course, if we're really lucky, some of the things that we write are turned into mass media also. Like that The Maiden is turned to a Polanski film, and then it has a second cycle to it, right? So your generation, one of the nice things, that many of them, Fuguet, for instance, now become a film director, right?
Yes.
I was wondering if you wanted ever to become a film director yourself.
No, never, because you must work with people. I mean, the reason I write books is that I'm a dictator in books. They all do what I want them to do. And if I don't obey, I can kill them.
No. They'll come back to haunt you. Look, I will tell you this. You cannot do anything you want to your characters. They own you. They possess you.
Okay, but don't tell them.
No, very often, I don't need to tell them. They know it. I own that, and then my wife reads my books and says, blah, 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 blah. No. Or yes, this is where you want to go. So she owns the books as well, you know, in that sense.
Your wife, and my wife makes this job also.
Well, I'm not going to propose, I don't want anybody else to do this, so I'm not going to give my stories to her, and you don't give my stories to my wife, who's here in the audience.
Well, I don't think we should be suggesting as three men that this is what wives are for when you're...
No.
Do you have a wife?
No.
Oh, okay. You need one, man.
I'll take anybody you choose, Santiago.
That's very dangerous. Basically, you know, this is the truth, and it's important to say this because this is a story, Latin American story of love. You know, I would not exist today. I would not be alive if it weren't for my wife, for the love of my life. You know, we've been married for 47 years.
Sing there in the front row.
Please stand up. Where's the wife? That's the wife.
And no, seriously, you know, this is very important because the fact that there are three men up here is also there are women writers in Latin America, and there are women who allow the writing to exist, and they're the backbone of our Latin American society. So I just thought it was a good opportunity as we were talking about.
Yes. There was a time, I will not say names, okay?
No. You see, no, don't say.
But I know many very important writers, not just Latin American, but elder than you, and for them, still, the wife is kind of a bodyguard, a secretary, a mother, a wife, a friend. And that's you can feel while age is coming down, how relationships among writers and women have changed, and how they are not devoting their lives to the writers. It's a very little detail, but it's very interesting.
It's very interesting indeed. But you know, in our case, we went into exile. I mean, that's another thing we haven't spoke about. Yeah. Both of us are outside Latin America. And one might think, oh, this is very strange. I mean, here comes the Jaipur festival, and they, instead of inviting somebody who lives in Latin America, they invite people who live outside Latin America. But it turns out that a great deal of Latin American literature has been written far from Latin America, you know, very far from Latin America. Among other things because very often it's intolerable to be there. The distance that you get from being far allows you to say certain things. And this is the story of Latin America, is the story of the exile of Latin America. The first great Peruvian writer, I hesitate to even say whether he is Peruvian or not, is the Inca Garcilaso, right? And the Inca Garcilaso is the son of an Indian princess, right? And a Spanish conquistador. Yes. And then, when does he write? He goes to Italy, discovers the Neoplatonists, and with those ideas of the archetypes, he reinvents the whole idea of the relationship between the Spanish and the indigenous populations. So, to go away is to come home in some sense. You cannot come home. We cannot even speak about Latin America unless we've had a journey out. And the journey, in our case, and for us, it was Paris. The idea was Latin Americans go to Paris, and Cesar Vallejo, the greatest Peruvian poet, and perhaps one of the greatest poets of all time, he says, I will die in Paris
con aguacero.
Con aguacero, in a day when it is raining. And he did. He died in Paris a day when it was raining.
There's always raining in Paris.
No.
I agree with you. I changed a lot my literature when getting out from my country and seeing my country with the distance. I would add that it was very important in the 70s, in the 60s, when the big Latin American boom began, Spain, because many of these writers, Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, were writing about dictators and authoritarian leaders, and of course they couldn't publish these books in their countries. The funny thing is that in Spain there was also a dictator authoritarian leader, Franco, but when they make these books, Spanish censors would say, well, this is not us, really. This is all this Latin American army and
nobody's going to read anyway.
Yeah. And what happened is that many Spanish people begin to read these books because they would recognize his dictator in our writers. And that was very important for the political novel in the 20th century, I guess.
And today, the Spanish novel is Javier Maria's, I love his work. It's wonderful work. There's been Pérez Reverte, you know, Antonio Muñoz Molina. There was, during the Franco dictatorship, because of this, there was not a very strong Spanish style. And this is a very interesting, the post-dictatorship novel in Spain is extraordinarily, and the relationship with language, which was freed by the Latin Americans, now they're helping us to free our language again. It's a very good exchange, which is somewhat, I suppose, similar to the exchange up in India, at least those who write in English, and the UK, let's say, right?
Yes.
Well, it seems to me we could continue all night long because there's so much else to talk about.
Let's go on. We can see.
All right, but
there's no problem.
Throw us off in 5 minutes.
But there's nothing after this, you know.
You have a press conference.
I have, yeah, but...
See you later. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question and then take questions from the audience. My favorite novel from Latin American literature is this one, Donna Flor and Her Two Husbands by George Amado. Which one would you like to recommend for people who want to find something from outside what they might know?
It should be something that is published, at least in English.
I can start. I can start.
All right.
I'm going to start with a novel which is very difficult, but it's the most wonderful novel, and it is available in English. It's called Hopscotch, Rayuela, by Julio Cortázar, who is my god and my brother as well. They even say he's dead, but it's not really true. He will never be dead. He will never be dead. And this novel is a very playful novel, which deals with... in fact, it's interesting because there's a lot of Indian philosophy in it. It's a group of expatriates who are in Paris, one of whom is called Oliveira, olive tree, really. And he's going to end up in Buenos Aires. But the book goes back and forth. You can read it in many ways. At the beginning, he has a sort of an instruction. You can start it at the end or start here or there, and you can play with it. And this is one of the most extraordinary writers that we've ever produced. And his short stories are also wonderful. And he will come back again and again and again. So Cortázar, C-O-R-T-A-Z-A-R. He also has a book about Jaipur, in fact.
Really?
Yes, he has a book about the temples nearby, where he speaks about that and the relationship with destiny. He's constantly, India is part of his imaginary. So I really suggest that as one book that you should read, besides our books which you should read assiduously.
Well, I probably would recommend something that you can get here, a little novel of Garcia Marquez, which is not magical realist, which is called Crónica de una muerte anunciada.
Yes,
What's the name in English?
It's Chronicle of a Death Foretold.
And it's a fascinating little novel. It's a novella about a couple of guys who are going to kill another one, and everybody knows. And everybody knows this is going to happen, and if anybody could tell this to the victim, this wouldn't happen. But a strange things begins to happen to avoid the victim to know, and the construction of this novel, the way each word is important for the story is a master class of literature.
Let me just, I have to say the following. Angelica and I were, with Garcia Marquez and Cortázar and some others, in a jury in a prize in Mexico when he had just completed the novel. And he said, I can't give it to you or my wife will kill me. I said, well, you know, we don't want that. We want you to continue. I said, but, so we talked a bit about it. I knew what it was about. And he said the following: what I most like about this novel, it's because he had to investigate. This was a personal friend of his who had been killed 20, 30 years ago. Right. And therefore he wanted to, and he said that the cuchillazo, the stabbing that had been done finally to this person at the very end, you begin with the fact that he's going to die, and then he dies 45 minutes later when you finish the novel. So the novel is contiguous in time. And he said, what I most like about it is that this person was stabbed in these and these places. I didn't know that. And that when I wrote it, I said that it was between this and this vertebra. Then I went and they discovered after the novel had been finished, a friend of his sent him a clipping. And the autopsy said that it had been exactly there. He said, I love the fact that I imagined where this was. My imagination prepared this. And in a sense, that's the perfect way of doing Latin America, as his imagination anticipated or remembered what reality was, and reality mirrored that afterwards. So it's this constant relationship between the imaginary and the real and the factual, which is what made us up here on the stage, right?
Very fine.
Yes.
Well, we're going to take some questions. Laura.
Question here. Come to you next.
The question is for Ariel. I know I was at your earlier session and I asked a question about Bolaño. This question is somewhat different. I noticed in Latin American literature there was a strong strain of what might be called bibliomania, this obsession with the craft of writing and then the whole thought process which goes into it. If you look at some of Borges' stories and then a writer which you mentioned, Javier Moros.
But he's Spanish. He's Spanish.
He's Spanish. Even in some of his books also had a long exposition on the craft of writing. And now Bolaño with his unparalleled bibliomania. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, you know, the fundamental text of the 19th century in Latin America is called Facundo by Domingo Faustino Sarmiento. And it begins with a quote from the French, On ne tue point les idées fortunes. Now, Sarmiento was doing this, you do not kill barbarians, you do not kill ideas, but he misquoted it. It was Diderot who had done it. So what I'm saying with this is that this idea of the book being very important, the craft being very important, the words being very important, because it matters. Each word matters in Latin America. If you get it wrong, you get reality wrong in some sense. And therefore, the idea that the books, we have so few readers in Latin America and so many books that we write. We write more books perhaps than readers we've got. So we are very worried about the craft. But I would like to say that we're not the only ones, right? I mean, after all, Percy Lubbock wrote The Craft of Fiction based upon the fact that Henry James was the model of how many different ways you can write perspective, right? It's just that I insist on this. You know, though whether we're political or not political, we have an enormous amount of tortured, exiled, executed writers. I mean, I could recite the amount of people who have been killed because of their ideas, because of what they wrote. So it's very precious what we write. We'd better get it right. We better get it down to the last word, because that one word is really, really important to us. But you yourself can speak more about that, I think, Santiago, about, I mean, your own craft. You worked on how long for El Rojo?
It's hard to say, because I usually spend many years thinking, thinking the things before I actually sit and write. And then I usually have a couple of abortions of each project. When I write, in the worst case, I wrote 300 pages, and then I realized that it was horrible, and I couldn't continue. But so, in the end, when I just sit and begin to write to the end, it's like 6 months. But the whole project from the beginning usually takes like 6, 7 years. And it's true that I just realized after publishing my books abroad that all the work I do for words comes really from a Latin American tradition. I mean, in fact, I didn't want to be prestigious. I wanted to be rich and to make popular bestsellers. But I realized too late in my life that I had never read bestsellers. What was bestseller in my childhood was Vargas Llosa, Garcia Marquez, Ariel, Dorfman. That was the bestseller, the very prestigious literature making risky things. And that was my model of writing. Trying new things with the words, trying to make a bit of experiments at the same time that having a popular plot and a good story. So
well, Umberto,
it's not something I choose, it's something that happens.
Umberto Eco once said to me that what he desired was what Stendhal had somehow said, which was to be bought by everybody and read by the select few.
Yeah. That's what my publisher wants also.
We have a question stage left.
Thank you so much for your time. In my very limited experience and observation, and my friends who are from Latin America, it feels like, above all other people or sort of professions, the people of literary influence experience are elevated to national heroes above all else in Latin America. I sort of hesitate to use that word, but that's sort of been my observation. And so my question is, do you agree with that? Is that accurate? And if so, why is that in Latin America?
As a national villain of my own country, Chile, because I've been crucified for being so critical, I will pass on that question.
No, I know why they are so important, writers in Latin America. And he's being humble not to tell, because it's the same reason he is important for my generation and his generation. During the 60s, the 70s, the writers were the only guys who could talk about what's happening under dictatorships almost everywhere in the continent. Media were censored, writers were censored, but people who know how to use words, who were independent and therefore not suspicious, who travel, who sometimes didn't want to travel but were exiled, and so were listened to abroad, were writers. And that made things, that made writers very important in those years for what was going on. They were the only ones who could know and talk what was going on, and I admire, respect a lot that position. I'm happy not to have the same position, because that means things are better for the continent.
And they're better for you too.
And they're better for me, of course.
It's a terrible responsibility, and,
Yes.
and we get it wrong very often. When you become this public figure, you get it wrong very often. And it's not a good place to be. In other words, we have to fight for a place where we don't have to do these things, because the politicians and the people should be doing them, not the writers.
Yeah.
But if they're not doing it, then one has to do it. One has to go into the breach, let's say.
I always say this, but when you say it, sounds better.
That's only because I was brought up in New York, and if we were speaking in Spanish, you would say it better, I'm sure.
We have another question over here.
All right.
Over, sorry, to your right. I'm standing. Yep, here we go.
Hi, my name is Aditya, and I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about the idea of this large, expansive body of work clubbed together as Latin American writing, and not from a particular nation, that you all belong to different nations, right? And not being talked about in a lot of places as separate, but as together.
Well, my friends and me, we make a lot of jokes about everybody wants us to be Latin Americans while we are Ecuadorians, Peruvians, Chileans, and we look at ourselves very different. But it's true, and I realize that in travels like this, that we have many things in common. We are a community which is not the same in Europe or Asia or Africa. We all share the same language. We all share a very similar story, political and ethnical and in many ways. So it's true that usually in fact we share, and this is amazing, and I can feel it in Europe, we share a sense of humor.
Yes.
A very black one, usually. Yes. But I easily find in Europe, in meetings and that stuff, I always end up with a Latin American in the corner telling jokes about politicians, and many of them very politically incorrect for Europe. And it's true, we have a lot of lots of things in common. So looking from abroad is not really strange that we are a community. We are a community.
It's strange because George W. Bush infamously said once, while going above Latin America, he said, "Hey, all these countries are different." Now, he said this out of sheer ignorance, but very often the ignorant can hit upon the truth for the wrong reasons. So it's true, there are very, very many differences. On the other hand, I met Santiago, though he met me in that bookstore in Lima many, many years ago, right? Through Donald Duck. But we met just an hour ago, but you can see in our relationship what is typical of Latin America, right? In other words, we share a lot of things in common. We have a history in common. We know a lot of people in common, and when he says I'm skeptical about certain things, I understand. And when I say I'm committed about certain things, he understands.
Yes.
We understand that this is part of a fractured reality, which is part of the same community. So I think this has to do with how enormous continents come together. You have a subcontinent of your own, and there are things that you simply share because there's a frontier, and then there are newspapers, and there's television. There are things that we have in common.
But it's true that, and I'm realizing that here, that we are more similar than Indians.
I would say so, yes.
They have how many languages here? 17?
No, more than that.
I mean, many official languages, yes.
We have many indigenous languages that are not recognized as official languages, you know, so that's also true.
But in the majority, we have 2 languages and very similar, Portuguese and Spanish. So really we are more similar among us than
I'm not
Indians.
sure if this is not, by the way, a very elite phenomenon. Whether it's not the fact that your generation and my generation, the other generations, we're all university people, we read, we write. So we create this community of the readers and writers of Latin America. And if you go to the soap opera, then they see your soap operas, but I don't know how much you really have in common. It's a question that I've got, you know, I'm not looking down or up upon the people, but I'm saying there is a challenge from the popular to us constantly in Latin America. And I'm just wondering about that. I mean, because it's sort of a myth, you know, el pueblo latinoamericano, the Latin American people as such.
Which means me and my friends.
Right.
Which means me and my friends, yeah.
Right. No, but they exist. They are there, and they are demanding certain things of us in a way, even if they don't know us or don't read us. And for me, my literature has always been about those who are left out. Always, always, always. I'm always worried about that because in the end, we're all going to be dead and left out. So we might as well leave some mark here so that when death does take us, we can demand something of the living as the dead demanded something of us. That's also a story, by the way. Yours are full of dead people as well. Yeah. They're always asking questions of us. And if we don't answer those questions, be very careful about what will happen to us if we're not true to the dead in some sense.
Do we have time for more questions?
We're very close to the end. A couple more minutes. We're going to have one question here and one over here.
Okay.
Maybe they can ask both questions and then we can answer them together. So, yeah, because otherwise. Okay.
Hi, Santiago and Ariel.
Hi.
We're both teachers. Back here.
Where are we?
So here, straight up ahead.
Yeah,
Center.
It's just the lights which are blinding us.
So we're both teachers, and we're both really excited that you said your favorite book is The Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Marquez, because we teach it.
Really?
Yeah.
Good.
And our students love it, and we love teaching. What just shocked us a minute ago is when you said in passing that it's not magical realism, while we've been teaching it in the context of magical realism.
I'm sorry. But I meant there's no people flying, no people with pigtails, no people with all this
but there are elements of magical realism.
No, there isn't. No, there really isn't.
Can you tell us?
There really isn't. No, there really isn't. There really isn't.
Happening in a normal time?
Because what's happening is that what is happening is absolutely extraordinary. And what Garcia Marquez is doing there, he's taking something which was a crime that happened many years ago, and the supposed narrator is going around trying to picture and put together the puzzle of why it was that the whole people saw that this was going to happen, and they did not stop the crime from happening. The story is the story, if you want to know what it's really about. It's about the fact that in Latin America, the macho culture did not allow them to intervene in a problem between two men who wanted to kill another man. And that is the curse of Latin America. And therefore, it's not about the magical, because if it were magical, then he at the end would have flown away, or a witch would have come, or somebody would come. No, the terrible thing in Latin America is that people die every day on the streets of what is being foretold for them. And he says at the end of his Nobel speech, you know, we are condemned to 100 years of solitude unless we look to this and we become 100 years, I would say, of solidarity. We have to change this, not out of political things, but because that's what we need to do. And therefore, what's tremendous about that nouvelle is that the characters are caught, they're trapped inside their own stories, their own version of reality. So the versions of reality that they are projecting out are magical and fantastic, but it's not magical realism. It's a horrible realism in some sense, which is peopled by this extraordinary imagination of Garcia Marquez.
But you can teach it in a non-fiction course.
Yes.
Okay, we have time for one last question to your left. To your left.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Sunil. I just wanted to ask you a question. Is Latin American literature just equated with Spanish? Because Brazil is the largest country on the continent. So is it going to be equated with both Spanish and Portuguese? And is there a regional element of, say, Hispanic English on the way or something?
I should like to congratulate all the audience for some extremely good questions.
Yes,
actually.
very
Yes.
good. Do you want to go with Brazil and then we'll...
It's about the relation of Brazil and
Yeah,
us,
the
isn't
fact
more
we
or
keep
less?
on speaking about Latin American literature, and of course Brazil is such a large part of Latin America. This is here.
I took it for granted this man is a Brazilian. Jorge Amado is a great writer from Brazil, and everybody talks about him like being part of Latin American culture. In fact, in the last years, Brazilians are beginning to speak Spanish much more than before. They used to speak English, and now they are beginning to open the scope to Latin America, which is their natural place. And many things in many countries in Latin America are beginning to have links with Latin Americans, not just in culture, but in politics and commerce and relationships. I was never excluding Brazil. Well, Portugal. Nobody talks a lot about Portugal.
Yes.
In fact, it's a very strange relationship because we Latin Americans, Hispanic Latin Americans, were always, our colony was Spain, and Spain kept being richer than us. But Portugal became less important than the colony, than Brazil, and that has put a shade into Portugal. But Brazil is always into the same landscape.
We have a great relationship with Brazil, obviously, but very often we need those novels to be translated to Spanish for us to read them.
Yes.
In Latin America. What happens is that Brazil, though it's only one country, and it's this enormous country, has a history which is in many ways similar. In other words, the same community we're speaking about goes, the sense of humor, the zest for life, the obsession with death, the slave culture, but in the case of Brazil, they were not part of the emancipation process of Latin America. I mean, you know, the Argentines went over the Andes and came to liberate Chile, not because they wanted to liberate Chile, but because they had to get to Peru, so the Peruvians could not continue, the realists in the 19th century beginning, could not attack Argentina through the middle of the continent. So the story of Latin America, his country and my country, are joined by the fact that we were part of the same process. When the Battle of Ayacucho ends, we end the liberation of Latin America. Brazil is 70, 80 years later in a very different thing. The emperor from Portugal comes and he installs himself in Brazil. You know? Just to say one last thing, because I think this is a good way of ending in relation to the Battle of Ayacucho, which I put in a historical novel because I love that image. This is the last great battle of the southern part of Latin America, the 1824, I think, something like 1824, right? And the realists, the people who are the Spanish army, and the criollos, those who are part of that, are confronted at the highlands of Ayacucho, on the very high plains of Peru, the plateau of Peru, with a smaller army which confront them. And before the battle begins, there is a moment of peace. And people from both sides come together and hug each other because there are brothers on one side and fathers and sons, and they're all like that. And then they separate and they come together and kill each other. And then the Spanish finally give their flags in, and it's the end of the Spanish occupation of that part of Latin America. But before that, there is this moment of los abrazos, the embraces, the hugs, you know? And I think we've been trying to embrace each other since then and to end the civil wars. And the ones who remind us of what we can do, of how it's wonderful we can imagine a different reality, just by thrusting it down the throat and up the gut of people, in spite of it, into the conjunctivitis of the people, right? Mm-hmm. So they can sign themselves in the mirror and say, like Santiago, that's not me, oh, I grew a beard. Yeah. So something will happen there. I think we're looking for those moments of the embrace. You know, our countries have been at war with each other 2 times already in the last 100 and so years.
And you always win.
Let's not get into all that. Right?
No. And it's time to end that. It's time to end that, you know.
It's ending.
It's ending. Thanks to his father and I mean, thanks to a certain vision of Latin America, which I think is coming. We are not going to fight wars among ourselves anymore. We're not going to kill our brothers. We are not going to do this. We're going to read each other's novels, and that's what we should be doing.
I must add, before they throw us out from here, that your generation was very important because the exile was very important.
Yes.
There was also an idea of being Latin American who was forced into exile. Well, all the exiles from exiliés from Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Peru were together, and these are the people in the governments. Right
These are the
now.
ones who are governing Chile now, are the exile generation, right?
Well, my friends, this was one of the most fascinating hours of my entire life in literature.
Really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
You should come to Latin America. You'll have a
Come
wonderful life.
anytime you like. And also, I wanted to say, you know, one of the repeated lines of the festival this year has been, has literature become too event-centered, and has it gone too far away from reading? But I think we can see today that sometimes these events are really nice, and everyone has a great view of the literature of your country. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thank all of you.
there's a book signing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, Ariel has to be whisked away to a press conference.